Hey there! If you love exploring Christian philosophy and theology, you're in the right place. The video's about to get started, but first, I want to ask you a question. Do you find the content I produce on this channel valuable? If so, here are some ways you can help promote it. The first is completely free. Give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Second, consider doing a one-time donation, kind of like a tip. You can do this in the form of a super chat or super thanks below. Third, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get early access to videos, they get to be a part of a patron-only Facebook group we call TAC Academy, and patrons can participate in the book club that meets on Zoom once a month. The link to become a patron is in the description. Thanks to all my current patrons for your support. Enjoy the interview. Is God unworthy of our worship? Well, today we're going to be looking at two arguments that aim to show that any being who commands our worship is unworthy of our worship. It's an interesting topic, and my guest is Frederick Choo. Hey there, Frederick.
Hi, Jordan. Good to be on.
Thank you so much for joining me. Frederick, you are a student at Rutgers University, earning your PhD in philosophy right now. You started the program pretty recently, right?
Yeah, so I just completed my first year.
Okay, yeah. So I'm excited to see what you decide to do to write your dissertation on. I know right now you're undecided. So, but this paper that you wrote, it came out pretty recently, I think this year, right? 2022?
Yeah, just this year.
Yeah. So I'll hold it up so everyone can see it. Can a worship-worthy agent command others to worship it? I will have a link to this video in the description. Or I'm sorry, a link to the paper in the description of this video. And the paper considers two arguments against worshiping God, I guess you could say, or that God would be unworthy of worship. And the first is the egotistical objection. And then the second is this impossible to worship by complying objection. So we're going to break this interview really, I guess, into three parts. In part one, we want to first just unpack what we mean by worship. In part two, we want to look at the egotistical objection. And then in part three, we want to look at the impossible to worship by complying objection. So that's what you're going to get out of this. You're going to see these two arguments and hear Frederick's responses to each. So let's go ahead and jump right in. First, I'm curious, what led you to write on this topic?
Yeah, so I was generally exploring the philosophy of worship literature, trying to understand stuff like what is the concept of worship, or what grounds God's worship worthiness, what grounds the obligation to worship God. And in it, someone suggested one of the ways we can ground an obligation to worship God is because God commanded it. And that kind of inspired me to write on this topic, because I was an atheist once, and I think one of the things that drew me to atheism was the idea that God commanded worship, and I found it quite repulsive. Like, what's wrong with God? Why is he demanding worship? Yeah, and so I wanted to kind of look more into this to see, is there a way out of it or not, and is this something Christian philosophers should be working on?
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so what exactly are you aiming to show in the paper?
Yeah, so in this paper, I consider two ways one might argue that a worship-worthy being could not command worship. And I try to show both of such arguments fail.
Okay, now we're getting into the good stuff here. So what is worship?
Yeah. Okay, so I looked quite a bit into the literature of worship, and most philosophers try to talk about worship as having two components. So the first is the act of worship itself. So this might be like giving praise, singing a hymn. So those are the acts. But remember, you could do the acts. You could, for example, sing a hymn, but inside you could be distracted. You could be thinking about your computer games. You could be thinking about doing something else. And so the mental state that you have really matters a lot when you do all of these acts. And so that's the second component, having the right mental states. And that's where the disagreement comes in. So different philosophers have different ideas exactly what mental state is involved. So in my paper, I try to kind of summarize the different kind of mental states that people think are involved. And I myself think worship actually involves all of these mental states. Yeah. So roughly the mental states that I include gratitude, so like thanking God, includes praise, includes being in awe and wonder. So finding God amazing, and you find this in like Christian worship songs like Amazing Grace. And then there's the idea of reverence, which is a very form of deep respect that you have. And there's love, and also there is taking the object of worship as maximally great or morally perfect. So this being must be very, very, very great, and that's why you worship it. Yeah.
Okay. So 2 components. There's got to be this mental state and these actions that I guess act on those states.
Yeah.
And then you broke down several of the mental states involved: gratitude, reverence, or awe, love, and God being morally perfect. I think there was one more I might have left out, but those were a few that you mentioned. Okay, so I actually found that part of the paper really useful. I've thought before, like when I'm at church and I'm worshiping, like I've thought, what exactly am I doing here? And some of those came up, like, well, I'm giving thanks to God, or I'm being in awe of God right now. So I really enjoyed this, just that much of the paper. Now we know what worship is, but there are these 2 arguments against any agent that would command worship. That such an agent would be unworthy of being worshipped. So the first is this egotistical objection. Can you lay this out for us? And I do have a slide that will lay out the argument, so you can just ask me at any point to put that on the screen.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe we can just put it on the screen first.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and do that.
Yeah, so this is the egotistical objection. So premise 1 says, if an agent commands worship, then that agent is egotistical. Premise 2, if an agent is egotistical, then the agent cannot be worship worthy. And so we get the conclusion, if an agent commands worship, then it cannot be worship worthy. Okay, so let me just talk about premise 1 first. And the idea for premise 1 is to imagine someone who seems very virtuous. For example, Mother Teresa, who does a lot of good acts. But imagine right after she finished those acts, she asks everyone to praise her. She commands praise. Suddenly it seems that there's something wrong going on here. There's something odd about Mother Teresa for commanding it. And it seems she isn't so praiseworthy after all. Why? It's because her commanding praise seems to reveal some form of egotistical nature. So the term egotistical, I'm using it quite broadly. Some people might differentiate between different terms like pride, egotistical, being self-absorbed, attention-seeking. So all this whole family of vices, I capture it under the word egotistical or pride in my paper. And so that's the ideal. If someone like Mother Teresa commanded praise, commanded worship, it reveals that she's egotistical in some way, or perhaps she did all these good acts just to make herself look good after all.
Okay. Yep. Now, in the paper, you go through the piecemeal reply to this, or that's the label that you give it, the piecemeal reply to this objection. So why don't you lay that response out first?
Okay. Yeah, so for the piecemeal reply, it was kind of inspired because I was looking into, are there any recurrent responses out there in the literature? And I think the only one I really found was by Paul Copan, a Christian philosopher and apologist. And his idea was to say, look, what exactly is pride? Yeah. And on his account, pride is having an inflated sense of the self. You think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. And so he argues, look, if you take that account of pride, that analysis of pride, and you see whether God would be prideful for commanding worship, he wouldn't, because he would deserve it, and he's already maximally great. He can't have a inflated view of himself. So that's one way to try to deal with the objection. But there are many accounts of pride and the nearby vices like being egotistical, attention seeking, and so forth. And so what the piecemeal reply would do is to say, okay, we can take each account of pride, and then we can show on every account God wouldn't be egotistical on any of these accounts. And so I kind of talk about a few accounts, like pride is about acknowledging your limitations, or pride is about taking credit when it belongs to others, and show that, yeah, it is plausible to try to work it out and say God would not be prideful on all these accounts by commanding worship.
Yes. And that was helpful in the paper. So depending on how one defines pride, Paul Copan's response, you go through each one of those accounts, the kind of response you just gave, it could work. However, in the paper, you mentioned a couple of accounts of pride that it seems like that response won't work on those accounts. So can you explain that?
Yeah. So when I was looking at a few accounts, I thought this piecemeal reply could work. But then as I looked into more accounts, I thought, I don't really think it works after all. It won't work on all accounts of pride. Yeah. So in particular, there are a few accounts. One was that pride involves some excessive concern for social recognition. You want people to recognize what you're doing. On another account, pride is about a concern about your good qualities. So you're very concerned about, for example, how you look, whether you're smart. It's a very inward kind of thing. And on another account of pride, it's about flaunting your good qualities. So you want to show others. It's more outward in nature. Yeah. And on all these accounts, it seems plausible that when a being commands worship, it reveals that the agent actually has such motivations behind it. And so I'm a bit skeptical of the advancing a piecemeal reply because of that.
Yeah, and I think this is what was really nice about the paper. I got to hear maybe what I've heard before, that type of response, like, well, God, if he's maximally great, then he would be worthy of this kind of, like, worthy of worship. He doesn't think of himself more highly than he should. He's maximally great. He can't think of himself any more highly. So yeah, but I hadn't really thought about the response that you give. So you give a different kind of response. Why don't you lay that one out?
Yeah. So the response that I think is a better one is to try to say, look, God actually has non-egotistical reasons available to him to issue the command. And my idea was this: I was thinking about Mother Teresa again. Is there any circumstance in which she commands praise, and I would still say she is virtuous? And I thought, actually, yes. For example, if she commands praise, and the reason why she does it is actually maybe terrorists are holding someone hostage, and ask her to command praise. If not, they will kill the hostages. And so she does it in order to save the hostages. Now that just seems praiseworthy to me, and that seems something we should all applaud. And so once you know that her true reasons for commanding praise, you would think, yeah, she is still praiseworthy. Yeah. So I try to go into two plausible reasons I think God has, which are non-egotistical in nature.
Yeah, that was the creative reply. Now, I'm sure the viewer wants to hear each one unpacked. So you give two non-egotistical reasons that God would command worship. What's the first one? Explain it, and then we'll go to the second.
Okay. Yeah. So the first reason is that worship is actually good for the worshippers. And I cash this out in terms of the worshippers' well-being and their moral characters. So one way I go about it is I talk about empirical research in experiencing awe and wonder, which is involved in worship. And the idea was simply that the studies regarding awe show that when people experience awe, they feel happier and satisfied in life. And this lasts even after the experience of awe. It also tends to promote humility, and it also increases pro-social behavior. So people are more inclined to look out for one another, help one another, and just be more moral in general. Yeah. And I suggest the same thing could be said about the other components in worship, like gratitude. If I'm constantly grateful, I feel happier in life rather than being a grumpy person who's ungrateful. Yeah. So that's the first reason, that it's actually good for our well-being and it's good for our moral characters.
Yeah. There's some overlap there with some videos that I've made in relation to Pascal's wager, where taking the wager has earthly benefits, not just benefits in the afterlife. And I go through some research like what you've discussed. But yeah, so that's really interesting to think about how worship can actually be good for our own well-being. So yeah, why don't you go to the second non-egotistical reason that God would command worship?
So the second reason is simply that worship actually helps to improve the relationship between the worshipped and the worshipper, which is God and religious believers. And this is kind of more like a mutual benefit. It's something that both parties want, and the relationship itself is a good, loving relationship. Yeah. So I have a couple of sub points in which I argue for it. So first is that when we reflect on the good qualities of the other person and things that they have done for us, that improves the relationship. We appreciate them more, we love them more. And my idea was just thinking about stuff like constantly telling my wife I love her, affirming the stuff that she has done for me, or even on special days like Mother's Day, birthdays, and we give words of affirmation and reflect on what the person has done. That certainly improves the relationship. Yeah. Especially those families who they might be arguing in a heated fight, and then Mother's Day comes and suddenly everybody is at peace and the relationship is restored after they try to make peace. Yeah. It improves the relationship in that way. Yeah. And so I think when it comes to worship, where you reflect on the things that God has done and all of that, it also improves the relationship in the same way. So that's one sub point. The second sub point is that worship actually helps us to know God more. And this actually draws from work by some other Christian philosophers who have explored this more. And in particular, they have explored the idea of corporate worship. In corporate worship, we can know God more. It is much like when you meet a friend one-on-one, you know your friend in a certain way, but when you meet your friend in a group, you get to see different sides of your friend, you hear different stories that your friend tells because other people ask different kinds of questions. And the same thing comes up when you hear different people choose different worship songs or worship in different ways, and you get to know more God through the experience. The third sub point is that worship is actually part of the enjoyment of God. It helps us to feel that connection with God. So this idea actually came from my friend who's a Christian philosopher, Andrew Locke. I think you had him on before.
Yeah, I've had him.
Yeah, and I was at Hong Kong at that time, and he kind of was talking about worship and soccer. And he kind of said, worship is a bit like soccer, where when my favorite team scores, if I can't say anything, if I have to keep quiet, maybe because I might be disturbing my wife nearby, I can't really enjoy the game. But when my favorite team scores and I can say, go, and jump up and shout, that is actually part of the enjoyment itself. And it helps me feel more connected to the team, a sense of loyalty and all of that. And even better, if other people are with me cheering for the same team, I feel connected to them. Yeah. So in this way, worship helps for us to enjoy God and feel that connection to Him, and perhaps even other believers as well. Yeah. And so I think I have a quote from C.S. Lewis in my paper to do with that, where C.S. Lewis suggests when God commands us to worship Him, it's actually Him inviting us to just enjoy Him.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I find all that really plausible. Those seem like very good reasons to command worship. But there are some objections to this type of reply. So, what are some of those objections to the response you gave?
Yeah, so the objection I considered is actually by two atheist philosophers who actually have wrote along the lines of the egotistical objection. And one concern that they really have is that worship will undermine our moral autonomy because worship requires some form of unconditional submission and obedience to God. So my reply is, well, I think God can actually issue commands in a way that would avoid all of this, that would still give us space to exercise our moral autonomy. So just imagine if every moral decision God is right there and telling you exactly what to do, then you would lose your moral autonomy. But if the frequency is reduced and how specific God gives you the content is also reduced, then you will have space to decide. So if God says, give to the poor, but He doesn't tell you on every occasion you must give to the poor, you can kind of choose when do you want to give to the poor, how much do you want to give to the poor, or which poor group of people do you want to take care of? Is it perhaps the poor elderly, the poor younger children, in Africa, nearby? Yeah, you have all of that options and you can kind of weigh and decide. And so you do have more autonomy even in such cases. Now, another worry one might have regarding a moral autonomy is perhaps God issues certain commands and it contradicts your moral beliefs. Yeah. And so when there's that contradiction, then it seems that it undermines your moral autonomy because now you must do something that you believe is wrong. So the way I address this in the case of religious believers is, well, religious believers often take God as a moral authority. We think God can create moral obligations. Okay. Or at minimum, you would think God is an epistemic authority. So God knows what our moral obligations are, and He's kind of conveying it to us, telling us what actually is the right thing. Now, if you're a religious believer and you accept either of these, when God issues a command, then you will end up believing, well, what He says is the right thing to do. And so there just won't be any clash between the command and your moral beliefs anymore. If there still really is clash, then most probably the religious believer will just think, perhaps that's not God speaking, or perhaps this is not a worship-worthy agent after all, and I shouldn't submit to it. In that case, there still isn't any unconditional submission because you already judged that's not a worship-worthy being.
Mm-hmm. You explained that really well. Okay. And we're moving at a good pace. So that pretty much finishes part 2 of the discussion, which was on the egotistical objection. So if it's okay with you, can we shift to the third or the impossible to worship by comply objection?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So I'll put it on the screen and just like before, walk us through each step of this argument. You might mention who came up with this argument.
Yeah. Okay, so the idea for this argument comes from a paper by Campbell Brown and Eugene Nagasawa. I think the paper is called I Can't Make You Worship Me. Yeah. And they basically had this principle in their paper. We can call it IWC for short, which stands for impossible to worship by complying. And what the principle states is that it is impossible for people to comply with a command to worship. Okay. So first, let me just explain what they mean by compliance. So the idea of complying with a command is that you act according to what the command says and that your motivating reason for acting is because of the command. So let me illustrate this. So imagine I'm walking to school and then my parents drive by and they command me, go to school. But I don't care about what they say, perhaps. Perhaps I just want to go to school to meet my friends. And so my reasons for going to school has nothing to do with what my parents say. My reasons has to do with meeting my friends or for my own education. And so what they would say about this is, I'm not complying with the command. I'm just going to school because I want to. Yeah. So compliance requires me to have to follow the command, and that my motivating reason is because of the command. So that's compliance. So based on this idea of compliance, Brown and Nagasawa, they argue, look, in worship, you cannot actually comply. If not, your worship won't be genuine. And the reason why is, well, if your reason for worshipping is solely a command, then it wouldn't count as worship on any analysis of worship. Because the analysis of worship requires you to be grateful for what the person has done, to feel in awe of what the person has done, and so forth. So in the same way as if someone commands me to thank them and I say, thank you, right? But I'm not actually thinking or reflecting about any good things the person has done for me, I will not be genuinely thanking them. I will not be genuinely grateful. So they have the same idea. Anyone worshipping just based solely on a command and not because they see the being as great or they are in awe of the being or they are thankful towards the being would not count as genuinely worshipping. So it is impossible to comply with a command to worship. Okay, so that's their principle, IWC. And so based on that, I came up with this argument. So premise 1 says, if an agent commands worship, then either A, the agent fails to know IWC, or B, the agent knows IWC but commands worship anyway. So premise 2 takes on A and says, well, if an agent fails to know IWC, then the agent cannot be worship worthy. And the reason is, well, it doesn't seem like this agent is very smart or very great if it fails to know this principle that we know now. Premise 3, if an agent knows IWC but still commands worship, then the agent cannot be worship worthy. And the idea here is this, look, if people can't comply with a command, it's impossible for them to do so, then what reasons could there be to issue such a command? It seems that they would be purposeless. And surely a worship-worthy agent won't issue purposeless commands. So therefore, regardless of whether the agent knows or does not know IWC, if it commands worship, then the agent cannot be worship-worthy.
Okay, you laid all that out very clearly. And yeah, when I first read that argument, I was like, yeah, there's something to this impossible worship by complying objection. And you gave that example in the paper of like, if my parents commanded me to wash the dishes and I go wash the dishes, but I don't do it because they commanded me, I just do it because I'm sick of the mess, or I can't stand it, or can't stand the smell or something like that, then it seems like I didn't really comply with what they commanded. I'm just doing it for my own reasons.
Yeah.
So yeah, there is something tricky about that. So how do you respond to this argument?
Yeah, so I did note in my paper that one way to respond, and this is done by another philosopher, is just to simply reject IWC and say that's false. Yeah. But I wanted to explore another kind of objection, and I rejected premise 3 of the argument and say that, well, premise 3 assumes the only reason for issuing commands is compliance. Okay? But I think that assumption would be false. I think there are other reasons to issue commands beside trying to get the person to comply. So the easiest case is just think of a parent commanding a child, okay, telling a child, like, treat your siblings properly. Okay. Now, I think the ultimate aim of the parent saying that is not so that the child would treat his sibling properly just because the parent said so. I think what the parents actually want is you treat your sibling properly and you end up having the right motivations behind it, which is love towards your sibling. And so that wouldn't be compliance, that would be based on a different motivation itself. And I think the same applies to God and the kind of commands we see in the Bible, for example, love one another. I don't take that command as God saying, just show acts of love to one another, and the only reason you should do it is just based on my command. No, I think what God would want ultimately is for us to show acts of love and also have the right emotions and the right reasons behind it in the end.
So the command is really just serving as a kind of starting point. But the purpose of it is for you to develop the right sort of motivation to follow the command.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and I want to understand how that's working to reject 3. So, in that case, God knows IWC and still commands worship. I see. Okay. So, even though he knows IWC, he still has a good reason to command worship. So, yeah, that would be a rejection of 3. Okay, I got you.
Yeah. Yeah, because his aim is ultimately not compliance. His aim is ultimately that we show love to one another, for example, and that we are motivated by love for one another.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, and the example with the parents, I'm a parent. I have a 2-year-old son, and this is, this he can't fully grasp this sort of thing yet, but already I'm seeing there are some things that as I'm asking him to do them, they would fit this bill. I'm hoping that over time he gets a better understanding as he matures, that I'm not just saying this so that you comply with me or something like that. Like, there's better motivation. Okay. So what are some objections then to this sort of reply?
Yeah. So the one objection, and it's also by Brown and Nagasawa, I think, was simply that, look, all these emotions and all of that, they're not actually under our direct control. We can't control it. So even if I command you to love, and it's because I want you to do it motivated by love, you can't just choose to do it. Yeah, your child can't just immediately say, all right, this sibling who I'm fighting with, I'll treat him properly and I'll do it because I love him. And yeah, so we can't directly control, and that seems problematic because of stuff like ought implies can. Yeah. So I offer 2 replies. So first, I note that the command plausibly only applies to believers. And the thing about believers is believers already believe that they have received goods from God. They believe they owe their existence to God. They believe God is great, and they are in a really loving relationship with God. And so, given all of this, it seems very plausible that religious believers can have the right emotions and attitudes. And if needed, they can, for example, recall the goods that God has given them or the promises God has given them. They can reflect on, say, Bible stories to remember how great God is. And so, doing all of this will allow them to have the right emotions and mental state involved in worship. The second reply I have is that we actually have some form of indirect control over our emotions. So one way to think about this is, well, we can start by just doing the act first, and the emotions can be cultivated over time. And you can actually find this in different traditions. Like if you study Chinese philosophy, there's that idea over there where you do certain acts and then it will cultivate the emotions over time. Another way to go about it is to say that, well, we can do other acts beside worship that will help us cultivate the emotions. So I could say read more of my Bible and learn more about God, and then I will be more in awe about God. Yeah, I can develop my loving relationship with God more. I can record down, perhaps in a journal, okay, the good things that God has done for me, and so I can refer back to that anytime I need it. And so there are many ways to cultivate all these emotions involved in worship if we want to do it. Yeah. And so that's an indirect way of cultivating it. And so it is possible for us to ultimately perform genuine acts of worship.
Yeah. Again, some of that gets into there's overlap with some things that I've made in videos on Pascal's wager, where you can actually that's a common objection to Pascal's wager as well. You can't just force yourself to believe,
Oh,
but
yes.
there's ways that you can cultivate the sorts of things that you're talking about. Even if you don't have direct voluntary control over it, you can indirectly affect it. So, okay. Well, this was really interesting, and I'd like to wrap up this way. If you can fit this into 60 seconds, that would be awesome. So basically, in 60 seconds, can you summarize 2 ways that someone might object to God, God being worthy of worship if he commands worship, and how you respond to those objections?
Okay. So the first way one can argue that it's objectionable for God to command worship is
Oh,
that
wait. I'll your camera froze up. So restart, and because I want to isolate this clip if possible.
okay. So the first way that someone can argue that it's objectionable for God to command worship is that it would be egotistical for God to do so. So my response is to say, well, in the case of God, there are non-egotistical reasons available to him, and he could command based on those reasons. And the 2 reasons I suggest is first, worship is good for the worshipper in terms of the worshipper's well-being and their moral character. The second reason is that worship is good for the relationship between religious believers and God. And so worship is good in all of these ways for the religious believer. The second way to argue that, sorry, let me redo this. Okay. The second way that one might object to God commanding worship is that we cannot comply with the command. We can't do it because he said so. And my response to this is, well, God doesn't want us to do it just because he said so. He wants us to have the right emotions and attitudes involved ultimately.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you so much, Frederick, for coming on and walking through your paper. And you did it so concisely, but it was good. For those that want more depth, I'd encourage you to check out his paper, Can a Worship Worthy Agent Command Others to Worship It? Again, the link for that paper is in the description of the video. And I would encourage you go and check out some of my other videos. There will be more that pop up here in just a moment. So thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.